Yeah, we're going through Mary Wollstonecraft now. She's the final reading for political science. And we'll see a little bit of how she shares some ideas in common with the other writers we've covered, but how she takes things in a somewhat different manner. For a lot of folks, when they first read Wollstonecraft, they're struck by how contemporary many of her ideas are. But it should be kept in mind she is writing in about 1792 or so. This is a time period in European history that's called Romanticism. And one of the reasons why this strikes people as being so familiar and being so contemporary is most of the ideas, the political ideas that we have today in the United States, actually come out of this time period. This idea that people have some kind of innate equal rights and everything else comes out of Romanticism, out of the 1776 revolution, and out of the time period we know from the late 1700s, early 1800s. So she's writing in England during the time of Romanticism, and this is not, romantic love or anything like that. This is the idea that people are inherently good. This is when the ideas of liberalism that we recognize today, that people are rational and capable of good actions, really takes a foremost position in politics and society and other parts of the culture in Europe and the United States. So that's when she's writing. Much of what she is doing is actually moving much of the philosophy that was being written at the time and moving it into women's rights. But she's also taking it further, not just into women's rights, but into society as a whole. So she's not just writing about women alone, but as you're going to see, about society as a whole. Some of the writers of this time are John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and as she does mention here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Some of these you may have heard of, but she has read them all and she's moving them into gender issues and taking them a little bit further. The writing of this book, she completed it in a very rapid time period. So I do want you to be aware of that. The writing is often quite rough. It is quite rough at times. She seems to be not so much concerned about the writing style as concerned with promoting these ideas, which really, again, are rooted in the romantic ideals that many Americans recognize as being part of our Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. So she's just taking them slightly further. And again, I should mention some of those names. Again, Kant, Immanuel Kant was a Prussian philosopher who had probably the most profound influence on many of the writers of this time. He's often forgotten by many, but John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, many folks have heard of. Okay, so let me go through this for a bit. She is, I should mention, historically quite interesting, is the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So she is the mother of Mary Shelley. Now, if you would, go to page 47. Then in paragraph 3, about halfway down, paragraph 3, about halfway through paragraph 3, she has this to write. Virtue, likewise, can only be acquired by the discharge of relative duties, but the importance of these sacred duties will scarcely be felt by the being who is cajoled out of his humanity by the flattery of sycophants. There must be more equality established in society, or morality will never gain ground, and this virtuous equality will not rest firmly even when founded on a rock, if one half of mankind are chained to its bottom by fate, for they will continually be continually undermining it through ignorance or pride. And this is very important. The way she goes about it, even though the ideas seem quite contemporary, I do want folks to be aware that they are often quite different. One of the things she does at the start of this quotation is she connects virtue to duties. In other words, what is virtuous and good and what should be admired in humanity is always tied not to station in life, but to the duties which you perform. In other words, how you act and how you behave and your motivations for how you act and behave. That's what society needs to foster, which is virtue. And the duties those are tied to. Then she goes on to mention how half a society doesn't have equal virtue because they do not have equal duties. And this, in this sense, she's referring to women. When she says, if one half of mankind are chained to its bottom by fate, she is referring to women there. That's pretty evident. For they will be continually undermining it through ignorance or pride. That's also women. So in many senses, many contemporary folks are used to modern feminism extolling the virtues of women. What she's pointing out is that the women of her time don't demonstrate virtue because their duties are not equivalent to men quite often. They don't have the obligations, they don't have the responsibilities, so they cannot foster virtue. These two things cannot be broken apart. When women are dependent upon men in society, they don't have the duties and the responsibilities. Therefore, they cannot develop the virtue that Wollstonecraft sees as absolutely necessary. As absolutely necessary. Jump on, if you would, to paragraph 4. It is vain to expect virtue from women till they are, in some degree, independent of men. Nay, it is vain to expect that strength of natural affection which would make them good wives and mothers. Whilst they are absolutely dependent upon their husbands, they will be cunning, mean, and selfish. And the men who can be gratified by the fawning fondness of spaniel-like affection have not much delicacy, for love is not to be bought. In any sense of the word, its silken wings are instantly shriveled up when anything besides a return in kind is sought. So what she starts to make it clear is that independence of women is how you foster virtue. And so this is a bit of a tension within her writing. It is a bit of a dichotomy, and you can see how these are dependent upon each other. If you want to create somebody who is virtuous, they must first be independent. That independence is what puts them in a position of being responsible, not just to themselves, but to others. By being independent, they become responsible for themselves, but also responsible to others. It puts them in a position, and this is an important concept, of obligation to others. Independence creates obligation. In other words, now I have duties to perform for other people, and I recognize them. Other people are not taking care of me. I am responding to what I need to do for other people. That's the very important turn she wants to see in society. By gaining independence, in other words, by not being dependent upon the husband to support them financially, to support them politically, to support them socially, that her status is not entirely dependent upon him. When they gain that independence, they can then develop virtue. And that virtue is only developed through recognizing duties to other people. And her end game is not an entirely independent woman, but a woman who recognizes her duties as a wife and as a mother. So in that sense, she's still very much a part of the family unit, but it's one who recognizes duties to other and is much more independent, and as we're going to see, more rational. More rational is what she's going to develop. Okay? So I hope that's clear so far. She is, in many ways, echoing what we see today as modern feminist approach, but in other ways it is quite different. We have to always respect that about it. If you'll jump up to paragraph 6. Paragraph 6, this is on page 48. To illustrate my opinion, I need only observe that when a woman is admired for her beauty and suffers herself to be so far intoxicated by the admiration she receives as to neglect the discharge the indispensable duty of a mother, she sins against herself by neglecting to cultivate an affection that would equally tend to make her useful and happy. True happiness, I mean, all the contentment and virtuous satisfaction that can be snatched in this imperfect state must arise from well-regulated affections, and affections includes a duty. By affection, she doesn't mean just liking something. She means an emotional obligation to something. This is an idea she's actually taking from Kant, but it's where we emotionally feel an obligation to other people. To understand that emotional obligation, and it really is a felt sense of obligation to another person, you must have some kind of independence. When she is only admired for her beauty, what she points out here is that women become intoxicated. And that metaphor is quite real. And that, no, she does not mean that you're drunk, but in drunkenness you lose control of yourself, and the most important thing is you lose control of your rationality. So beauty goes against, or when it's pointed out and when it's emphasized, debases reason. That's what it does. When women are only prized for their beauty, they lose the faculty, or have it debase the faculty of reason. Reason is what makes people fully human. When they can use their reason is when they're independent, and that's when they can develop their virtue and their obligation to others. So that independence is dependent upon reason, the faculty of reason. And women have just equal ability to foster that as men do. This is what makes her into a liberal. She's taking the ideals of romanticism, which were again fostered by Kant, by Locke, by Rousseau, and others, and she's applying them to women. These were, by and large, although not entirely, fostered for men. Rousseau was pretty blatant about that. Kant, less so. He saw women as being quite rational too. But what Wollstonecraft is making a very central object of her piece is that women have the capacity for reason just as much as men. That is what makes her a liberal. She's not trying to centralize things, but trying to see it as being distributed and seeing other folks besides men as having the capacity for reason. And that is, of course, women have it too. Okay? That's what, in general, makes her liberal. If you'll jump up a bit, I'm going to skip over some of the issues with soldiers and others. Those points are very important, but I do want to jump to a few other issues. So those points that she makes about military, I will mention just somewhat quickly, she is somewhat cagey on whether or not women can serve in the military. Promoting this idea in 1792 would have been ridiculed. Many of her ideas were ridiculed, which we'll get to in a bit. But she is oddly cagey on this idea. She doesn't say women shouldn't be in the military. She just doesn't quite come down on it clearly. So, which tells me she probably would not have been too troubled by it. But anyway, so let me jump up to page 51, paragraph 15. And she starts talking about laws and how society as a whole should be governed. And she says, a truly benevolent legislator always endeavors to make it the interest of each individual to be virtuous, and thus private virtue becomes the cement of public happiness. An orderly whole is consolidated by the tendency of all parts towards a common center. Very important concept. In other words, the state is strengthened by the rationality of the individuals. This is what opposes her to Machiavelli. This is how Machiavelli is conservative, and that he sees the state as being sustained by a strong individual. And this is what makes Wollstonecraft a liberal. And that the reason are civil laws, independence. You want independence and rationality to create a stronger state. The more rational people are, and the more independent they are, the better state they make. They make a stronger state by being more independent. They don't end up thinking of only themselves. They end up contributing to the state because they see they have a duty to the state. This is where she is going far beyond just women's rights, and where she is a classic liberal that we would recognize today, and that she sees the civil laws not creating dependent people, but creating more independent because the state is dependent upon them, not they upon the state. That's where she's the flip of Machiavelli. Okay? And if you jump up to page 52, this is paragraph 17, and I'm going to try to actually get towards the end of Wollstonecraft. But paragraph 17, the being who discharges the duties of its station is independent. And speaking of women at large, their first duty is to themselves as rational creatures, and the next, in point of importance, as citizens, is that which includes so many of a mother. So notice what she does. She makes it very clear. If you are not independent, first and foremost, you cannot discharge your duties. So independence automatically brings a duty to others. First and foremost to yourself, but that is not the end game. Being independent for herself is not the end game of Wollstonecraft. Being independent is the start of recognizing your duties, and the first duty, and this is where she is quite distinct from modern feminists, is your duty as a mother to your family and to your children, to your husband. So, or wife to your husband. These are duties within the home first, and that's where it starts. It starts at the individual level and then goes out towards society as a whole. But in the home is the first place where those duties are realized. Jump over, if you will, to page 53, because you're going to see she doesn't stop there, and it's very important. She doesn't see independence as an end game in itself. And very important to understand, she doesn't see being a mother as an end game in itself. That's where many people were stopping at this time, and for many generations after, stopping with the obligations of women were only to themselves and as mothers. She's going to take it further. 53, paragraph 20. This is paragraph 20 at the top of 53. But to render her really virtuous and useful, she must not, if she discharge her civil duties, want individually the protection of civil laws. She must not be dependent upon her husband's bounty for her subsistence during life, or support after his death. For how can a being be generous who has nothing of its own, or virtuous who is not free? This is a very important point. First of all, I do want to point out the word want is not mean to, I want to get something. It's not that sense. It's in the sense of being without, which is somewhat similar, but it really means being without. She cannot be without the protection of civil laws. Civil laws are not the same thing as criminal laws. They are civil laws, the rights to property and things like that. These are what lawsuits and things like that are about, who owns what. These aren't so much crimes, but who owns what. Civil laws, independence. Civil laws created in England at this time made women dependent upon men. In other words, it put the primacy of the husband over the property of women and made them dependent upon the men. So by changing the civil laws so that women could have access to their own property, that's what she saw as being absolutely essential to creating better women. When they can control their own property, they can control themselves better and contribute more to their families and to society. Well, that cannot really be done unless you really revolutionize society across the board. In other words, women are going to have access to education, to positions, to society, to voting and other things across the social realm. It's not just going to be, I can hold on to my own house. It's going to be, I can have a position in society. I can work as a doctor or a lawyer, anything that men can do. That's where her ideas are truly revolutionary, because they're going to require a change in the civil laws so that women are no longer dependent upon men. That's where she is truly radical for her time, and not just reflecting the ideas of Kant, Locke, and Rousseau and others. She's asking for a revolution in society that affects half the population. But she's not just doing it for the sake of women, but for the sake of society as a whole, that these civil laws must be changed. And watch what she does with that and how she takes it further. Jump, if you will, to paragraph 22 at the bottom of 53. I'm going to go halfway through the paragraph, and you're going to see this odd little idea mentioned. She says, this is again halfway through 22. I may excite laughter by dropping a hint, which I mean to pursue, some future time, for I really think that women ought to have representatives, instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any direct share, allow them in the deliberations of government. She is point blank saying women should have the right to vote. This was, at this time, an absolutely revolutionary idea. This is in 1792. The suffrage movement didn't really get going until around 1850. Women were declared ineligible to vote absolutely, without question, in 1832 in England. They were never allowed to before, but it was made law to make darn sure it didn't happen. So you may have had a queen or a position here occupied by women, but overall women were excluded entirely from governance by not being allowed to vote. They were entirely dependent upon the men who decided on the representation, and they could only vote for men to represent them. This did not happen in England until 1928. So this was coming within the last 100 years. Many people forget this. So this would have been laughed at her time. And it was. So the suffragette movement did not get going until after Wollstonecraft. But notice she takes this idea of the civil laws and the dependents much further than just saying we'd like access to education. It's going to be a total and complete equality. If you'll jump up to, let's go to paragraph 24, and I'll wrap it up there. Paragraph 24, if you would. This is on page 54. How strangely must the mind be sophisticated when this sort of state impresses it, but till these monuments of folly are leveled by virtue, similar follies will leaven the whole mass. For the same character in some degree will prevail in the aggregate of society, and the refinements of luxury, or the vicious ripenings of envious poverty, will equally banish virtue from society, considered as the characteristic of that society, or only allow it to appear as one of the stripes of the harlequin coat worn by civilized man. That's a very tough paragraph to follow, but what she's pointing out and what she continues throughout the rest of the piece is that the problem of hierarchy. Hierarchies are something that were brought up really with in all of the readings, and they were a component of a more conservative society. Conservative societies see hierarchies as absolutely necessary. To keep order of the lower classes, you must have upper classes in charge, and you must have distinctions. What she's pointing out here is that economic inequality is creating problems at both ends of the scale. Magnificent wealth and dependence are creating people who are not virtuous because they are only concentrated on their wealth. And respect is going towards position and not towards virtue. What she's also starting to point out, what she's going to bring up towards the end of the piece, is that poverty is making people focus just on subsistence and not on fostering virtue. So poverty is equally creating problems for society. The extremes, the economic extremes of great wealth, are creating people who are sycophants and only paying attention to status and not virtue. But at the other extreme, when you're having people who are in grinding poverty, they could only be focused on their poverty and subsistence and not on creating virtue, not on behaving in a way that's more responsible to society and to other things. So that's what she finishes up with, is going after hierarchies throughout society. Economic and political hierarchies she sees as a threat to individual virtue, but also to the state as a whole. Okay, I'll wrap it up there. Keep going with this. I will give another video on writing the essay. All right, take care.